My guest this afternoon, Neama, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
So what do you make of this? Is this at all a surprise, any aspect of this verdict?
Nothing surprising about this verdict at all, Dan. In fact, this is what we expected before the trial, and probably why Rowland wanted to fire his attorneys, because they told him the same thing. There was overwhelming evidence in this case, and you have all types of murder cases here on Law and Crime. Some with some evidence, some with a decent amount, but this is probably the most. He is literally found in the crime scene, the vehicle covered in blood, the trunk covered in blood. There's video surveillance of him having the victim get in his car, trying to sell the cell phone, everything from his ex-girlfriend testifying that he was cleaning the murder weapon, DNA under his fingernails, something that the defense in their opening said didn't even exist. And that's probably why the defense didn't present any evidence or witnesses in this case, and they barely cross-examined many of the prosecution witnesses. So this is what prosecutors call a slow guilty plea, someone that really couldn't accept responsibility for his actions. And I hope the judge punishes him at sentencing and sentences him to life in prison, because this is a very sad and tragic case.
What we heard from the judge and the family members, in their pleas for justice here.
Dan, I agree with Joe, and together we've sat in this chair many times. We've covered a lot of these cases, but this one was particularly horrific and brutal and heartbreaking. I mean, there's victims in every case, but this one really was something else. And I think part of the issue with this particular defendant and his family, the really public proclamations of innocence despite overwhelming evidence. The case that the defense team presented, which really defies all logic and credibility and has absolutely nothing to do with the evidence in this case. I think Judge Newman issued an appropriate sentence, because this is someone who, frankly, is a sociopath. And I'll use the judge's own words. This is someone that has a depraved heart, no remorse whatsoever for his actions, even in spite of the overwhelming evidence. That's the term I used, the term Judge Newman used, the avalanche of evidence. I mean, this person was clearly guilty. When we were discussing this case earlier this week and last week, my only question was, is the jury going to deliberate for less than an hour? And it turned out to be an hour and 7 minutes. So hearing from those family members, and we'd heard from them before, both during trial and during the bail hearing, just the pain and sadness and sorrow in their voice. And for this defendant to get up there and still say that he was innocent was really just, it was just heartbreaking for me. It really was. So I do think this is a fair and just sentence.
These scenes play out moments ago in the courtroom. Just so emotional, and to see how many lives have been impacted, destroyed, you can say, by this crime. The jury reviewed evidence in just 1 hour and 7 minutes, we learned. Are you surprised how quickly the jury was able to come to a verdict in this case?
Not at all, Dan. And starting with Mr. Josephson's testimony, we use the word heartbreaking, but here's someone who talks about how he wants to end his own life because of how his daughter was brutally murdered. I mean, how tragic. I'm a parent. Judge Newman talked about his own kids, and the most difficult thing for anyone to do is bury his or own child. And turning back to something that Joe mentioned, is Sammy was stabbed so many times that her mother was unable to identify her at the morgue. They had to match her using DNA evidence. And that's how horrific this bloodbath was.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a case that so many of these legal professionals have never seen before in their career. And like Joseph Scott Morgan was saying, it's not something that comes up very often. And what's so troubling, one of the many things that's troubling about this case, is that there was really no evidence that we know of, no priors, no indication that the defendant in this case was capable to commit a crime of this degree. What does that say about the nature of these crimes?
It's certainly uncommon to have someone convicted of murder and that being their first violent crime. And that's why one of the many reasons this was such a unique case. But, turning back to that jury verdict and why it was so quick, we talked about all the evidence, and rarely do you have all of this in one particular case. Rarely do you have the defendant arrested essentially at the scene of the crime. Rarely do you have this overwhelming blood DNA evidence. And one thing that we need to address is the defense said that there was no DNA, but ultimately there was Sammy's DNA under Nate's fingernails. So that's something that they misled the jury about. We have video evidence, the ATM. We have video evidence of Sammy getting into the car with cell site evidence.
A prime suspect, at least cross-examined. Why do you think he was eliminated so early on as a suspect in this case?
Well, he was eliminated because there was so much evidence against Nate Rowland. But I agree with you, Dan. Normally, the first person you look to is the boyfriend or the husband when a female is murdered. So he was very cooperative. And I like the way the prosecution presented this case. It really didn't matter how they did it. If you try this case 100 times out of 100, the jury's going to return a guilty verdict because there's so much evidence. But, the first witness has to be important for the state. You always want to start strong. And the first witness was Greg, the boyfriend. The second witness was Sammy's roommate. And they did a really good job telling the story chronologically in a way that made sense for this jury.
And it was very personal. It was really emotional to hear also from the friend, the roommate of Sammy. Describe the timeline here. I remember it was hard to listen and imagine the idea of seeing her shoes there in her room for work, and to know that she wasn't going to be coming back and she wasn't going to be going to work, and her life was ended so abruptly, so unfairly. Was the point here with the prosecution laying out this timeline, is the point to really connect with the jury on a very visceral level?
Yes, Dan, you want to tell a story for the jurors, and they told a story of a boyfriend, of roommates, of coworkers. That was the next witness, who were horrified when their friend, when their colleague went missing. They didn't show up for work. They described the panic, what they did. They went through her laptop. Ultimately, when they did see the video of her getting into a Chevy Impala, you'll hear these witnesses testify how they went looking for this Impala. They went knocking on doors, doing everything they possibly could to find their missing friend, colleague, and girlfriend.
And why start with that as opposed to just diving right into the evidence, which you've said many times was just so overwhelming, an avalanche even of evidence against Mr. Rowland? Why start with this timeline?
There's a couple ways to handle cases like this. You really want to come out strong. Oftentimes what prosecutors will do is those first witnesses will be law enforcement witnesses, folks that have testified again and again, veteran witnesses that will be able to connect with the jurors. But apparently the state, and rightfully so, they thought that these witnesses would be able to tell that story, to connect with these jurors. Even though they weren't spark of life witnesses, as we call them, they were able to describe Sammy, the type of person she was. They got out the whole law school story, how she was working her way through college. And then she had all these hopes and dreams, that she was admitted to Drexel School of Law, that she got a full ride. And they were able to get that very valuable testimony out through these civilian witnesses.
Yeah, well, let's take a quick break, but we're going to continue to talk about the strategy and how all of this went down. Prosecutor who's been covering this case here on the Law and Crime Network with me. Neama, are you still with us?
Yes, sir. I'm here, Dan.
All right, great. So, Neama, what happens next? Because what we do know is that this defendant, who's now been sentenced to life in prison, he still stands by his innocence. He says he didn't do it. Is there any path for appeals here? Is there any chance that this case has another chapter?
So, Dan, as an attorney, you always ask yourself, why is this case going to trial? Because such a small percentage of cases do go to trial. So in this particular case, the prosecution cannot give any type of deal. It's such a horrific crime. The last thing you want to do is give any type of discount. And you have a particular defendant and his family who refuse to accept responsibility. Compare and contrast that to the Durst trial that we're also covering on Law and Crime. And that's a very tough case for the prosecution, a cold case murder. So you know exactly what trial, because Bob Durst has a chance of getting off once again, just like he did for the murder of Morris Black. In this particular case, we saw the legal arguments that the defense made right before the jury returned that guilty verdict. One was that Fourth Amendment argument that law enforcement unlawfully stopped Nate Rowland's vehicle. And that's not a particularly good argument. The judge rejected that because there's plenty of evidence that Sammy got into a Chevy Impala. There's Facebook pictures of Nate Rowland standing in front of his Chevy Impala. So law enforcement had every reason to stop that vehicle. The other was the sufficiency of the evidence, and the judge just dismissed that out of hand. And again, talked about the overwhelming nature of the evidence. There's plenty of evidence to sustain a guilty verdict. On appeal, I anticipate two issues coming up. The first is Rowland's request on Monday of last week to hire a new attorney. Remember, this is the day before trial. The judge denied the motion because it wasn't clear that he had private counsel who was ready and willing to take the case. But again, I expect that to be an appellate issue. The other is going to be the effectiveness of his counsel, because again, I don't know how you defend this case if you're a defense attorney. I don't think there's any defense on the merits, but they didn't cross-examine many of the witnesses, the ones that they did. They didn't spend a lot of time there. They didn't really put up a defense, any type of defense. There was no witnesses called. Rowland didn't take the stand in his own defense. So I expect that to be an issue on appeal. But again, I expect this verdict to be affirmed and Nate Rowland to spend the rest of his life in South Carolina State Prison.
The movie about Kathy Durst and Robert Durst, their relationship, and you can see there it's Robert Durst talking about the film, talking about some of his regrets and how he treated Kathy's family in the early days of their relationship. Very interesting to listen to. I want to bring back in, though, Neama Rahmani, a former federal prosecutor, joining me this afternoon. Neama, want to ask you very quickly before our break, do you think that in terms of Durst's motion filed because he says he can't testify in his own defense because of his health, I mean, do you buy that?
You know, this is the defense's fourth or fifth motion, at least related to physical incapacity. Obviously, very different from mental incapacity. And Judge Wyndham has made it clear that he wants this trial to move forward. I mean, it's already been delayed, arguably decades. So John Lewin and the district attorney's office has said that, you know, Durst is faking it and there's really no factual basis for it, so Neama, I don't expect it to be granted. On
this, because Neama, the fact that we're hearing about the defense's desire to declare mistrial because of poor health, and in the courtroom now we're seeing this movie, All Good Things, being played. You have Robert Durst sort of narrating there and talking about sort of the past and his relationship with Kathy's family, some of his regrets. This is all pretty odd.
Very odd, but this is Hollywood in my hometown of Los Angeles. We're literally watching a movie that's produced by Harvey Weinstein, who was just extradited here to Los Angeles. So anything goes in this case. We're seeing parts of the Jinx. We're seeing, obviously, this fictional movie, All Good Things. And Judge Wyndham is allowing lots of testimony about Morris Black, whose trial happened out there in Houston, and Durst was acquitted, at least of the most serious charges. We're hearing about the Kathy Durst murder, obviously. That forms the basis of the motive for the Susan Berman killing. So really, anything goes in this case. We expected a 4 to 5 month trial, and because of all these delays, court being dark on Fridays, and Durst's health issues, it's probably going to go even longer than that.
Does anything stand out to either of you as just sort of not good decision making here by the judge when it comes to what the defense is asking for? Are there any errors you see being made from the defense, the prosecution, in some of these recent developments? Just to start with you, Neama.
it is strange to see movies being played, real kind of fictional, even the Jinx, you can call it a documentary. It is a fictional work. There's portions that were edited. I understand the admission at the end that the prosecution wants to get in and the defense wants to get in the full transcript. But to play, an entire documentary or an entire fictional movie is not something I've ever seen in my 20 years of practice as a prosecutor and defense attorney.
Or hurt the prosecution playing this clip.
And if you're the state here, you don't want the jury to feel sorry for Bob Durst, someone who's clearly frail. He has his catheter there, can't stand up without help, certainly can't walk around and is in a wheelchair. You want to show the old Bob Durst when these murders were committed, someone who is cold, calculated, heartless, someone that shoplifts, someone that uses food stamps, even though he's worth tens of millions of dollars. That's the Bob Durst that you want the jury to see. Now, what the defense did then and said, well, look, you can't just pick and choose the portions that you want to play, Deputy District Attorney Lewin, State of California. We want to play the whole thing. And that's how we ended up here, because of that rule of completeness. Judge Wyndham did allow this entire testimony to be played for the jury. And, this is a very different jury pool here in Los Angeles, very liberal. These jurors are not going to like these, frankly, this abusive testimony. What may have been appropriate decades ago or not inappropriate is certainly not appropriate now. So these jurors are going to be very turned off by an ex-husband who is admittingly grabbing his wife and telling her what to do and just engaging in all sorts of inappropriate behavior.
What do you make of what we've been hearing from Durst as he describes his relationship with Kathy and circumstances dating back years?
Dan, you nailed it. Circumstances. This is a very circumstantial case, completely different from Nate Rowland, the previous case that we covered. So the prosecution needs to do what it's doing and try to dirty up Bob Durst, present all this evidence to the jury that they won't like, someone that likes to break the law, doesn't want to play by the rules, and who's responsible for multiple murders and has never seen justice. So I understand why they're doing and they're presenting the case the way that they are, because there's not a whole lot of direct evidence in this case. So this is the only way to try it if you're the state.
Mr. Durst, talk about his past and the circumstances.
Yes, Dan, and likability is absolutely critical when you're representing a criminal defendant. So it's one of the most critical aspects of any trial. Does the jury like your client? And what John Lewin and the district attorney's office want to do is tell this jury, this is not someone that you should like. This is someone who's abusive. This is someone who admits to using drugs. This is someone who cheats the system. And what the defense is trying to do, on the other hand, is dirty up Kathy Durst, saying that she was unstable, she was a drug addict. They've used these terms. So, a lot of it comes down to both the victim and the defendant, who the jury likes, and not to mention the attorneys in the case, something Anna already touched upon. Their mini second opening when the trial resumed after the pandemic, that he's going to take the stand, and that's the same blueprint and map that they used in the Morris Black case. So we know Bob Durst is going to take the stand and try to explain away how he didn't kill his best friend, Susan Berman. Final thoughts, this is a tough case for the prosecution. Arguably the most evidence was in the Morris Black case. The number two is Kathy Durst, and they're stuck here trying to present a murder case involving Susan Berman. So they got to tie all these murders together to try to get a conviction on the most difficult case of all.